Okay, colleagues, welcome back. So, in an earlier video, we've been reading an article by David Brink from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and we ran into some issues. Specifically, there was this alleged contradiction between, sort of within internal to Mill's philosophy. And I don't necessarily want to assume that Mill necessarily has no contradictions. I'm not saying that. But in general, it is, I think, our primary task has to be to try to reconcile the thinker as much as possible, to try to show the internal consistency. And so I wanted to look at a different text. This is by Paul Kelly from Boucher Kelly 2017, which attempts to paint Mill in a more consistent fashion. In general, I would consider myself, broadly speaking, a utilitarian, a fan of utilitarian philosophy, and I feel that the confusions that we have seen in the Stanford article, they mostly stem from what I feel is sloppy use of language on the part of Mill, because Mill is not really writing, well, at least on utilitarianism and on liberty, was intended for wider audience. It was published in some newspapers. So I don't think that Mill necessarily focused on philosophical rigor when he was coming up with his formulations. But I think that in principle, in general, it should be possible to defend Mill's notions on a more, put them on a secure, more secure footing. At the end of the day, I feel that I apply some Mill's principles in my daily life. Again, today is my day off, and in principle, if I treated my job just as a job, I would not be doing these kinds of videos. However, I do sincerely enjoy thinking through philosophy, reading philosophy, and I enjoy it more than, I don't know, eating or watching cartoons or what have you, right? And so it is my conscious choice to read Mill instead of eating ice cream. And I feel that there has to be a utilitarian justification for that. Likewise, I have a driver's license, so I stop at the red light, and I also feel that there's a utilitarian justification for that. So anyway, let's look at the text and we'll see how it goes. So the text begins by talking about a potential conflict between Mill's utilitarianism and his liberalism. So that on liberty, Mill talks about how the only reason why mankind might be warranted in interfering with the liberty of any individual member is self-protection. So this is the famous harm principle, right? So this famous statement would seem to suggest that even if the limitation of liberty would result in a much greater social happiness, it is not a sufficient justification. And the question is, how does this square with the statement that utilitarianism is, the greatest happiness principle? Honestly, again, let me say this from the very beginning, right? It seems to suggest that limitation on liberty would result in much greater social happiness. It's not a sufficient justification. Well, I think it seems, but it's not true, right? In the sense that I'd say that that's the whole point on liberty, to show that in the long run, so once humanity has reached the stage where we can be improved by free and equal discussion, we have reached the historical stage, okay? And this is, if you want, the Rousseauian element in Mill, the positive freedom element in Mill. So Mill, unlike other liberal philosophers, is attentive to history. You cannot just apply liberty principle anywhere and everywhere. You have to have reached a certain historical stage where people are capable of being improved by free and equal discussion. So free and equal discussion. Once we have achieved this stage, then it's my rule utilitarian interpretation of Mill, right? Following this rule, which is the harm principle, this is going to maximize our long-term. It will reliably maximize long-term rational utility maximization. Maximize happiness, long-term happiness in a reliable fashion. And normally, because again, the only justification for interfering with the individual would be to prevent harm to others. And, so Mill sets up these two conditions. And under these two conditions, I think that Mill is going to say this famous statement would seem to suggest that even if the limitation would result in much greater social happiness, it's not a sufficient justification. Mill is just going to say this is never going to happen. This is never going to happen. That's the whole point. That's the whole point. If you fulfill these two prerequisites, these two conditions are filled, then it's never going to result in greater social happiness. And that is the justification for the harm principle in On Liberty. So this is my reading of Mill, that his liberalism stems from his utilitarianism, that Mill is a utilitarian first and a liberal second. And liberalism, in some sense, applies only in these particular circumstances. Not to mention that, again, Mill says that, so this historical stage for an equal discussion, right? But yeah, I suppose maybe we should add as a third condition, it applies only to adults who have undergone a certain kind of education and upbringing as children. So they are prepared to face these challenges, something like that. So it's not fine to interfere with adults once they have reached maturity. However, children can be interfered with, according to Mill. So again, so the harm principle actually is well, and once you get into self and other regarding actions, it turns out that most things people do can result in harm to others. So it's not really clear how much liberty is actually due to people. How much liberty can people actually enjoy, even if you just focus on the harm principle and not on this utility principle. Anyway, yeah. So Kelly talks about act utilitarianism, which is a familiar term to us. And so how do we square act utilitarianism with liberalism? It's basically, right? We cannot simply explain away this as consistency in terms of peculiar point of each work, because even on liberty, Mill claims that he builds his account on liberty on the foundations of utility. And again, I agree, but again, we have to remember it's utility in the greatest sense of the word, in the largest sense, utility in the largest sense, as permanent interest of man as a progressive being. Okay, and notice the two works were basically published at the same time, so I think it's our task to show how these two works are consistent. Okay. So the most sophisticated recent defense of Mill have begun with a return to his utilitarianism. In a series of highly influential papers, David Lyons, name we should remember, began to set out an account of Mill as an indirect utilitarian. At the end of the day, again, my solution is, having looked at my notes, I've double-checked this again, so my personal solution to this conundrum is to say that Mill is a rule utilitarian, and we have an act utilitarian justification of rule utilitarianism. So it's like he's an act utilitarian in principle, but in reality, precisely because utility calculation in any given case is difficult, in effect he's a rule utilitarian. But the justification for rule utilitarianism is an act utilitarian one, if you want. So we also have John Gray and Jonathan Riley. Students in the past who have read Riley's book said that this was the best source that they have seen of all the readings on Mill. So again, Riley's book comes highly recommended. More recently, Jonathan Riley, his optimal rule utilitarian interpretation. So Jonathan Riley actually has this optimal rule utilitarian interpretation. So rule utilitarians argue that social welfare is not best maximized by individuals trying to calculate what particular actions will pursue on each occasion, right? Because it's difficult. It can be self-defeating. Instead, agents should be guided by rules that indirectly result in the maximization of utility. So again, we cannot calculate maximization directly because, and again, the Stanford article talked about this, that sometimes it's difficult, it's costly, the future is uncertain. So we rely on rules, right? The key question faced by rule utilitarians is what is the status of those rules? Are those simply rules of thumb, shortcuts for practical deliberation? Then they themselves must be justified in terms of utility. And I think they are justified in terms of utility. But such rules of thumb are also always potentially reversible in light of additional utility derived from making exceptions. Yeah, and I'm not sure if the article is going to talk about this, but I feel that, rules as something stabilizing in society actually benefit from not having exceptions. It's like when I get to the red light, I shouldn't think of, do I need to make an exception for myself, right? Sometimes utility is maximized if people just follow rules automatically. Again, Mill is going to talk about laws and regulations, but also education, public opinion, right? So these are the four things he focuses on in utilitarianism. So an example here from Paul Kelly: one might conceive a rule in favor of freedom of speech, generally maximize utility because of expansion of knowledge, the challenging of false beliefs, accountability of government. However, a utilitarian might accept this, but say a general right of free speech is justified on intellectual grounds, but a general right excluding offensive speech is even better at maximizing utility. Well, again, I'm not. I think Mill's arguments are strong against this kind of line of argument. Mill is going to say no. If you exclude offensive speech, you're actually losing in the long run because some ideas are going to end up censored. But let's continue. So we could have a principle of free speech covering all forms of speech except hate speech or pornography. The problem with the rule of thumb approach is that it seems to repeat the initial problem because it always leaves the scope of the rule subject to constraints of utility. So scope of the rule subject to constraints of utility. And again, I'd say it's like in any particular instance of any kind of hate speech or pornography, it's hard to say exactly what the long-term effects is going to be. Again, Mill has a very robust, I think, general conclusion for the free marketplace of ideas. Suppose Galileo's contention, against the Catholic Church was considered hate speech or pornography or blasphemy. These kinds of things could stifle the pursuit of knowledge. So I think Mill would not necessarily have a problem answering these kinds of objections. Anyway, in response to this argument, ideal rule utilitarians have argued that rules are ideal guides that to what maximize utility over classes of action, and not simply time-saving shortcuts for acts utilitarian deliberation. In this way, they directly determine the obligations, rights, and duties of individual agents. Agents, whether individual citizens, legislators, or politicians, are guided by these rules in determining how they ought to act. These rules are the direct source of obligation. So notice again, direct, indirect, utilitarianism. Calculations of utility are only indirect sources of obligation through their role in justifying the rules. Well, okay. On this indirect view, individuals. So this is one of the views. I don't think that this is the view I'm gonna espouse. But anyway, you should be aware that there is this view. On this indirect view, individuals are not required to make direct calculations of utility as part of practical deliberation. This must be justified on a variety of grounds. One might argue that most individuals are never able to make accurate utility calculations. Because of limits of time and resources. Because again, in any given case, it's very difficult to know exactly what the consequence is going to be. Alternatively, one might focus on coordination, conditions, and interconnectedness of acts so that no single decision can be separated from its connection with the decisions of others. So this kind of coordination problem. For example, a judgment of utility is going to depend on judgments about expectations of others. You see, exactly, yeah. So it's useful if we have a stable framework, and rules help stabilize social life, if you want, right? So that if I choose which side on the road to drive on, kind of it's a silly example, but still, if I'm choosing which side of the road to drive on, I'd better know what other people want, right? And so in this sense, the fact that everybody follows the same rules just simplifies life. Anyway, so judgment of utility is going to depend on judgment about expectations of others. Yes, yet these expectations are themselves potentially vulnerable to such individual calculations or utility. So it's like we run into this regress. I try to calculate what you will calculate, what you will expect, etc., etc. The question remains, however, that while it may be possible to defend a robust liberty principle, Mill does seem to endorse direct act utilitarianism in opening sections of utilitarianism. When he provides the so-called proportionality criterion of right and wrong. And we talked about proportionality criterion in the Stanford article, right? So this is, actions are good in proportion to which they promote happiness, and bad in proportion to which they tend to the reverse, right? Lyons had, however, argued that Mill also offered a more sophisticated account of moral and legal obligation in chapter 5, on the connection between justice and utility. So this is a very important chapter that we will need to read, colleagues. And some of you hopefully have already read it. Here Mill seems to acknowledge precisely the point raised by contemporary liberal critics. Instead of reducing questions of justice to simple calculations of utility, Mill offers what Lyons and subsequent revisionist scholars describe as sanction-based theory of obligation. So sanction utilitarianism. This claim that the concept of obligation or duty is analytically connected to the liability to suffer a sanction. Thus, an agent is only ever under an obligation when failure to perform a certain action would justify the imposition of sanction or punishment. This is punishability criterion. Punishability criterion, right? And again, we talked about this quote, right? We do not call anything wrong unless it's meant to imply that a person ought to be punished in some way, if not by law, then by the opinion of his fellow creatures, if not by opinion, then at least by the reproaches of his own conscience. Very important words. Let's take them to heart. Again, and we talk about this distinction between morality and simple expediency. It is part of the notion of duty in every one of its forms that a person may be rightfully compelled to fulfill it. Duty is a thing that may be extracted from a person as one extracts a debt. Anyway, so we derive a conclusion that obligations, whether moral, legal, or political, are derived from the liability to suffer sanctions. The principle of utility, as conveyed in the proportionality criterion, is not a direct source of moral obligation, as these depend upon sanctions and in turn related to moral rules. Anyway, rules are sanctioned by threat of coercive punishment, as Mill suggests, in conceding that duty can be extracted from a person. This is most clear in the case of legal rules, where law specifies punishments for non-compliance. Yet Mill attaches the criterion of punishability to all obligations. In the moral case, this means that someone is under a duty when their failure to comply with a rule should result in a punishment or the imposition of a sanction. Moral obligation depends on the enforcement or sanctioning moral rules. This does not mean that Mill is not a utilitarian, or this does not mean that Mill argues that any existing set of conventional moral rules and their respective sanctions give rise to morally justified obligations. After all, conventional morality may very well include all sorts of moral strictures, which utilitarian could not. Minor point, we don't need to. So Mill is a reformist. He doesn't say that all of our rules are good. Some of our rules need to be changed. Yes, it's true. Some of our rules, according to Mill, are subpar. They do not maximize utility, so they need to be changed. So Mill is still a utilitarian. So laws and regulations which exist but do not promote utility should be abolished. This is what this paragraph is talking about. Yeah. So one might conclude that this view still fits the view of Mill as a direct act utilitarian, so that failure to comply with the principle of utility merits punishment. However, this is unrealistically rigorous interpretation of Mill and does not take seriously the rest of his discussion of justice. Here Mill refers to the discussion justice-related concepts. Yeah. Anyway, in this way, not any action that creates disutility or pain for a person necessarily constitutes a harm. Not any action that creates disutility or pain for a person necessarily constitutes a harm. Not getting the last slice of a pie might cause some disutility in terms of frustrated greed, but this does not mean frustrated greed. Right? But this does not mean that I have been harmed. Nor does it mean that others should be punished for not giving me the last slice of pie. When Mill is talking about religion, when he's talking about offense, he's saying that the feelings of a religious bigot offended by somebody, let's say, who questions their creed, so offense of religious people. Mill is saying it's completely analogous to a feeling of a thief who feels his desire to steal another person's purse frustrated, right? So there is this little bit question of rights and how exactly do we define that. And I suppose, again, it's very important. Mill in chapter 5 talks about justice as common interest. And so we have a common interest in being protected from theft. So from this common interest, we derive a right to property. Therefore, the thief has no right to steal the purse. In fact, if the thief stole the purse, he would have harmed, in some sense, not only me, but everybody, because he broke the law. And the law protects all of our rights, all of our common interest. And so, likewise, I want to say that, let's say, when the Catholic Church is trying to censor Galileo, it's a bit of a simplistic example, you'll forgive me. When the Catholic Church is trying to censor Galileo, everybody should rally against the Catholic Church, beat on their doors and shout them down, because what they're doing is actually they're harming everyone, including themselves. The Catholic Church is harming everyone, including themselves, because they're stifling the progress of knowledge. Likewise, the thief should be decried by everyone, including the thief himself. I see a kind of parallel to Rousseau's general will, because again, it is the same way that free speech promotes long-term interest for everyone. In the same fashion, protection of property promotes long-term interest of everyone, including the interest of the thief, right? Because the thief doesn't want to get stolen from, right? So not any kind of disutility is equally a harm. So feelings of religious offense are not harm. Feelings of a thief who could not steal a purse is also not harm. Right? And a feeling of frustrated greed also is not harm. Okay. Mill provides an account of the language of moral right, wrong, duty, obligation as growing up around an understanding of what our most important interests are. And when we say our most important interests, right, so we talk about common interest. Common interest. Justice is common interest. Okay. So maybe some commentators talk about how priority of liberty and individuality should entail a rejection of direct variant of utilitarianism. Mill cannot have meant that all actions are to be judged in terms of utilitarian consequences if he meant that we should accept absolute liberty in the sphere of self-regarding actions. Priority, liberty, and individuality must entail rejection of the direct variant of utilitarianism. Okay, maybe. Let's see. Mill cannot have meant that all actions are to be judged in terms of the utilitarian consequences if he meant that we should accept absolute liberty in the sphere of self-regarding actions. It's complicated. It's complicated because I feel that, again, Mill says that, I mean, you still should be punished by your own conscience, I feel. So I see some room for disagreement. Even in the sphere of self-regarding actions, maybe. The important works of Gray and Riley developed this general approach, pioneered by Lyons. Thus, actions that violate my self-regarding sphere are actions that deserve punishment, as the liberty principle connects with my most basic interest. In this way, the argument of liberty connects very closely with the account of Mill's utilitarianism. Of course, this still leaves open the major issue of showing why, in utilitarian terms, liberty is such a central human interest that it must result in a libertarian political order. Gray concludes that it is this issue that shows up the weakness of Mill's liberal utilitarianism, rather than the fact that liberalism must collapse into individual judgments of utility. For Mill's defense of liberty does not merely require that liberty and individuality are central, but rather that they are overriding human interests. For Gray, Mill's utilitarianism fails because it must assume that there's some unique form of good or valuable life that attaches priority to the idea of individuality, when in fact there are many forms of valuable life that do not attach overriding significance to concepts of liberty. And again, I would disagree with Gray here, because that's the whole point. Maybe there are many forms of valuable life, but how do you know? How do you know? How do you know? How do you know? The only way that you can know is if there's free speech, and so freedom of expression, and there's also freedom of experiments in living, freedom to experiment, free experimentation in living, right? And that's the way in which you can find that there are many valuable forms of life, and you can then communicate this to others. But freedom of speech and freedom of experiments in living, in a certain sense, it takes priority. And again, you have to remember that Mill assumes fallibilism, that we do not have anything like truth from God about what is the right way to live. So we need free speech and experiments in living in order to know what is the good life. We cannot say in advance. So I would disagree with Gray here. Anyway, in the end, Gray argues Mill must be committed to a giant wager that the ideal of individuality and freedom will have an overriding value to people. And I feel that Mill is prepared to take this giant wager because of what we talked about. Again, fallibility, free speech, free experimentation. Yeah, these are high stakes, and Mill is playing for high stakes. And you know what? I agree with Mill. I think if I understand the argument correctly, as Mill's moral psychology is naturalistic, he cannot simply assume. He cannot simply assume It's an a priori truth, and it's true. Yeah, you cannot simply assume, but you also cannot assume that there are, as an a priori truth, that there are many valuable forces of life that do not attach overriding significance to the concept of liberty. History and psychology might very well show, indeed probably do show, that people are happy with modest restrictions on liberty in order to secure other goods. You see, but that's the problem. You say show. But how do you know what anything shows, right? In order to show something, you need to, what does it mean to show, right? You need like a scientific investigation, or maybe an experiment. But the only way you can conduct an investigation and an experiment is only if there's free speech and that there is freedom to experiment. Otherwise, you cannot show anything. That's the problem with with authoritarianism and dictatorships in general. If we have a dictatorship, right, and our Ministry of Information controls all the statistics, and our Ministry of Information says that our country is the most prosperous country in the world, how can we trust? How do we know? Unless there is free speech, unless there's some guarantee that what they're saying is true, we have no idea of knowing whether we are indeed the most prosperous country or not, whether our army, let's say, is battle ready or not. It's just that how can we trust? Anyway, I'm prepared to dispute this claim on million grounds. So Mill's robust defense of the ideal of individuality might just be too demanding to support even an indirect utilitarian justification. Yet, despite the sophistication of indirect readings, they have not persuaded all recent scholars, and they have not done so for the important reason that they still need to explain the proportionality criterion rather than just abandon it in favor of the punishability criterion. Focusing solely on the latter might seem a selective reading rather than a fair interpretation. The most influential recent discussion of Mill offered by Fred Berger. Okay, Fred Berger is my hero. Okay, I'm with Berger. Okay, because Berger provides a reconciliationist view. Okay, this is feel free to disagree, but I'm just giving you this as a position that makes sense to me. Okay, not as the final truth, but as a conversation starter. So as a conversation starter, I'm with Fred Berger. So let's try to combine our commitment to both punishability and proportionality criterion. Let's try to reconcile. Berger's approach does not involve straightforward denial of Lyon's thesis, but it does suggest that this was not the only standard by which to determine right or wrong. One could also refer to the proportionality criterion. The reconciliationist thesis suggests that the principle of utility can serve as a direct standard of moral conduct and not simply as a principle for determining among ultimate ends. So, principle of utility can serve as a direct standard of moral conduct. There are numerous passages through Mill's voluminous works in which he uses either proportionality or punishability criterion. This might simply indicate a further level of inconsistency in Mill's thought. Fortunately, we can offer a general interpretation of Mill's enterprise which combines the two approaches. The reconciliationist approach is fundamentally act-utilitarian, so we're gonna be act-utilitarians, thus abandoning the claim that the principle of utility does not feature in moral deliberation. Conceding this role for act-utility calculations in moral deliberation does not, however, entail that all practical deliberation is exhausted by direct utility calculations. Yeah. So we are act-utilitarians. However, we recognize that sometimes direct utility calculation is too difficult to perform. Instead, we need to distinguish between different aspects of moral deliberation. Thus, we can appeal at one level to calculations of utility to determine rightness. The principle of utility as a criterion of rightness does not entail anything about what we should choose to do. The second aspect of practical deliberation might be best pursued by appeal to subordinate rules such as those of justice or the principle of liberty. The best way of achieving the goal of utilitarianism will normally involve acting in accordance with elaborate social practices such as common sense morality or the legal system, suitably reformed moral system. This might seem to collapse back into indirect theory, but around the punishability criterion, but it differs in important respects. Anyway, it accepts indirect theorists' view that the direct pursuit of utility can be self-defeating and have counter-utilitarian consequences. We talked about this in the text. Even Bentham talks about this, right? Sometimes to calculate utility directly is too costly. Too costly, too difficult, the future is clouded and uncertain. So therefore, we fall back on social practices such as common sense morality or the legal system suitably reformed. So we do not make an account of rightness in an indirect manner. For most indirect utilitarians, the criterion of rightness is determined by subordinate rules, whatever. Thus, utilitarians can accommodate liberalism at appropriate level. For Mill, the principle of utility is not the criterion of rightness. And I would agree with this. The principle of liberty is not the criterion of rightness, okay? What does this mean? It means that Mill is a utilitarian first, and then also, secondly, for utilitarian reasons, he espouses liberalism with conditions, under conditions. Which conditions? We talked about them, right? So it's supposed to be, we're talking about adults, we're talking about appropriate stage of historical development. We're also not talking about times of war. Mill explicitly talks about this. I haven't ever seen this in secondary literature on Mill, which kind of disappoints me a little bit, because I feel it's a very important provision, because Mill lives in the fin de siècle. He's not expecting anything as horrible as the First World War, but it's very clear to me from what Mill is writing and from the examples that he is giving. He talks about ancient republics in times of war, like Athens and Sparta, for example. And it's very clear to me that if Mill saw something like the First World War, he would say, yeah, of course, the British government. Well, again, okay, complicated story, but because First World War, Second World War, what exactly happened in politics is difficult to say, but imagine a country at times of war, and the survival of the country is at stake, and the survival of the citizens is at stake. Of course, the government can intervene. Again, as Mill says, we, provide people with liberty, with whatever, unless some recognized social necessity requires the reverse. Unless a recognized social necessity requires the reverse. So at the level of what one should do, Mill can quite legitimately argue that the principle of liberty is an overriding rule limiting actions of individuals and governments alike. This still leaves open the question as to why we should attach such significance to utility over other valuable ends of life. In next section, okay. I think that's it. So I am happy with my so this is fundamentally act utilitarianism. This is an act utilitarian justification of rule utilitarianism, under which the liberty principle is a good rule of thumb, which obtains in certain historical conditions and maximizes utility over the long run, and the justification is utilitarian, act utilitarian. But because act utilitarian considerations are difficult to do, we as a matter of practical behavior, we sometimes, often, act out of rule utilitarian considerations. And again, liberty harm principle is one such overriding rule. And the reasons for it, we have explored elsewhere. Okay, I'm going to pause here. So there's a lot of confusion in Mill, but I feel that we have worked through something today. And I feel that at least preliminarily, in my head, I have at least a sketch, a draft of defense of Mill, and I am happy about that. I hope you are too. So thank you, colleagues, for joining me today. If you have any questions, let's talk about them in the seminar. Otherwise, thank you so much for your company. Stay safe, take care, and I will see you around.